Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Lee Fanning. I'm a grants consultant with Hanover Research, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all this morning. Smaller groups can often be even more advantageous in terms of being able to ask questions and really have a dialogue about the content that I'll be presenting today and how that relates to your own grant seeking efforts at Lane Community College. And so do feel free to either enter a question in the chat function. If you have a question throughout, Katie will be monitoring that. Or you can also just unmute yourself and ask the question. We'll also have an opportunity both midway through and at the end of the presentation for additional conversation. So today we'll be looking at essentials of competitive grant proposals. We plan for the webinar to last about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time at the end for question and answer. And a copy of this presentation, recording, and slide deck will be available to all attendees following the presentation. So feel free to just sit back and enjoy yourselves. I'm in Colorado. We're having a very windy day. And so if you hear that gusting in the background, that's why. It's been quite breezy this spring in our neck of the woods. So what we're going to be talking about today is looking at developing your proposal in terms of framing your concept, program officer outreach, and a grant narrative breakdown. And then I've also included some resources that are linked at the end of the slide deck, grant seeker resources, and then resources that we as a consulting firm offer and are available to you at Lane Community College. So let's jump into developing your proposal. We like to start with the very critical step of framing your concept and making sure that your concept is competitive, because competitive concepts obviously lead to competitive grant proposals and get people excited about the work that you're proposing to do. And so in terms of a competitive grant idea, we've recognized that there are several aspects that define that competitiveness in the grant seeking world. A competitive idea should advance the funder's agenda. It should fill a demonstrable gap. And so that could be a gap in knowledge if you are proposing a research-based project, or a gap in services or programmatic elements if your proposal is more programmatic in nature. With the competitive nature of funding in today's world, we do always encourage that innovative piece, because we want the application to be very interesting, accessible, and something that's new and addressing that gap within your area of emphasis. Obviously, a competitive idea should produce something of value. It should be within a specific time frame so that reviewers and the funder understand what you want to do and when you plan to do it, and then have a strong and measurable impact. I review grant competitions through the Department of Education and also have done that through private foundations as well. And the question that I'm always asking as a grant reviewer when I'm reading a proposal is, so what? So they're proposing a great strategy, they've got a great project design, but 10, 20 years from now, what will that impact be? And how does that impact align with the funder's goals, mission, and their vision? And so let's talk a bit about framing, and the so what question leads right into framing. So in terms of the framing process, let's look at the gap in knowledge or services that your work will address. Does your work build upon work that has been done in the past? And if so, well, what are the next steps to advance that work to the next level? This duplication piece is critical in that funders want to know that their money is maximized, and that if someone else is doing what you're proposing to do, that there's at least a collaborative effort at play and not a duplication of efforts being involved. And then finally, in knowing your field, it's important to understand if your work is a priority for the field. And if so, who are your competitors? What are your advantages? I think there can be a lot gained by taking a snapshot and looking at professional organizations that relate to your field of work, looking at other universities and projects that align with what you're doing, even if they're not in the state of Oregon, and determining how that funding was obtained, if there are gaps, and also is there the potential for replicability with your work to other individuals that are focused on a similar area within the field, but maybe in another region or another state across the country. In terms of competitive proposals, it's also important to know your funder. And so when we're looking at who is funding the type of work that you are hoping to do, it's great to have a scan of the key federal, state, and foundation funders within your field to look at their current and future funding priorities, to look at funding trends in your field, who is getting the money and why. And then finally, are there overlooked opportunities, projects or programs that are designed to support researchers at your career stage? And back to the first bullet point specific to a funding analysis, I'm curious, Patrick, if you could contribute or add into any opportunities faculty and staff have to utilize search engines within Lane Community College, for example. Does the college subscribe to online foundation directory or another search engine tool that can be utilized?
Yeah, for private foundations, the college foundation has a number of those tools and can provide significant assistance to classified staff and faculty that are looking to seek out private foundation opportunities versus federal or state funding. And they have a number of people over at the foundation that do really good work with private foundations. We have a number of good relationships with those funders, like the Meyer Foundation and Oregon Community. But anything that's not federal or state, and if you're even interested in exploring what might be possible, I would suggest talking with Wendy, Jed, and Tiana over in Foundation, and I'm sure that they will be very happy to look through their resources and try to find a matching opportunity.
Oh, great. Thank you. And that having that assistance will save you so much time in the long run, because I think if any of you have actually engaged in prospecting to support your work, prospecting for grant opportunities, I think you'll find that it can quickly become a rabbit hole because there are so many opportunities, but finding one that is a competitive match for your area of interest takes time. In terms of framing, it's important that your approach increase the competitiveness, obviously, by addressing that gap and highlighting the gap that you'll be addressing by proposing something innovative, which we had discussed earlier, emphasizing that value added component. And then finally, once again, strong, timely, and measurable impact. And we'll talk a bit later about goals and objectives, but reviewers and funders really want to know that what you're proposing to do will be accomplished within that time frame, or most likely will be accomplished, that it's a reasonable goal, and that what you're proposing will have a long-term impact. In looking at building your strong concept, articulating that goal behind your idea would be a first step. And that goal can be an overarching statement with the measurable piece coming through specific to the objectives that you are hoping to accomplish. Certainly focusing your project activities and demonstrating how those activities will have the intended impact. In the concept stage, it's so important to identify key collaborators and then to pull them into the dialogue. I have reviewed so many applications that said that certain collaborators would be explored or collaborations, but those individuals or groups had not actually been pulled into that design stage. And that's tricky, both in terms of being able to propose a solid concept, but then also at the implementation stage. If you're funded, obviously, folks that you were hoping to work with typically would like to know that before the grant has hit Lane Community College and you're scrambling to get those people to the table. And then finally, establishing measurable criteria. And let's take a look at the goals and objectives specific to that. And so when you're looking at developing an overarching goal, think about where you want to be. And so an example would be my project's overarching goal is to increase participation of historically underrepresented students in the STEM fields. That would be a programmatic goal, for example. So goals really are the big idea. They're the answer to the so what. So you offer all these services, you provide X, Y, and Z. So what? People might show up, but are they really impacted by the work that you are proposing to do? So goals are not always measurable, and they do not typically convey how you might get there. So the goal wouldn't be to train teachers in STEM. The goal is to really have an impact on historically underrepresented students in the STEM fields. Let's move on to objectives. So objectives help to ensure that you'll reach your goal. They're the strategies you've identified. And so going back to the STEM opportunity in that example, the objective could be to effectively prepare a minimum of 65 teachers with the skills and knowledge to improve STEM curriculum for diverse student populations in grades K through 5. And so you can see within the example, there's lots of measurables. Well, what number of teachers? Well, at least 65. We think we'll touch at least 65 teachers. What student populations? Well, those kiddos that are in grades K through 5 will be impacted through this proposed project. Once you've got a concept in mind and you feel like you have a solid goal or set of goals and objectives that would serve to fulfill those goals, we always recommend developing a short concept paper. This typically is 1 to 5 pages, depending on your project and the funder that you're hoping to shop your paper to. It is a great process, both on an individual level, but also if you're collaborating with others on a particular project, to get the concept down. It serves as almost a project abstract. It's your elevator speech. And so you want to define the elements of your project. You want to really balance selling with telling and really have an impact in this. And so in terms of your communication of your project, the other wonderful thing about concept papers is that once you've got that in place, it is so much easier to then pull from your concept paper and then cater the language and information provided to specific funders based on what you already have down and finalized within the concept paper. And so in looking at introducing your project to smaller funders, you want to keep it short and sweet. As we all are, program officers are very busy, and it's helpful to develop an overview. We recommend the following sections. These are quite typical with regards to concept papers. And so it's helpful to include an introduction, a section on purpose and need, and include headers so that the program officer can really find the information and extract from it right away. A brief project description needs to be included, and that would encompass your project's goals, objectives. If it's research focused, certainly any research questions that you plan to explore. An implementation timeline that can be in a table format, or it can be a simple sentence saying that we expect that the project activities will be fully implemented within a 12-month funding cycle. Expected outcomes and impact. So that's your assessment and evaluation piece. Your budget funding needs and requested support. Now this, if your concept is developed enough and you actually have a program budget that is simple, like a one-page overview, that can be helpful to attach to the end of your concept paper. You can also have just a simple section where you describe in a couple of sentences the amount of funding that the project requires, funding that has already been secured or any in-kind donations, and then the amount of support that you plan to request. And then finally, don't forget your contact information. That's critical. That should be the key person at your institution that can speak knowledgeably about the project. So some key points with successful concept papers: you want to be concise with what you plan to do. You want to include a timeline. You want to include your target population or who will benefit from your proposed strategies. And then again, what is the long-term impact of your work? So with a concept paper in hand, once that is developed, we strongly recommend program officer outreach. Grant funding is most definitely a human endeavor. It's very relationship-based. We see a lot of grant seekers that resist building relationships with funders. But without relationships, grant seeking can be difficult, if not impossible. A monetary award obviously involves a fair amount of trust and a relationship between the funder and that individual or organization that's receiving funding. And grants are awarded also in the context of communities, and communities, as we know, are built on relationships. I'll add one more piece to program officer outreach, and then I'd love to hear, Patrick, from you with regards to the coordination that needs to happen internally at Lane prior to a faculty or staff member reaching out to a program officer. So we do know that most funded proposals involve contact with program officers at the funding agency. If you've not done this before, or if you're reaching out in terms of the types of agencies you are trying to engage, you'll understand nuances as you begin to develop relationships. There are some entities, if we're looking at the federal level, for example, the Department of Education, that if you can reach a program officer, you will likely get a fairly standard response. They're very aware of having a level playing field in terms of applicants and not wanting to provide any information outside of the solicitation that would not be accessible to all applicants, and typically have like a FAQ process where you can formally submit questions and then those will be published. There are other organizations such as National Endowment for the Humanities, again, looking at federal funders, who sometimes actually build in a review process prior to an actual grant deadline, where you can send in either a concept paper or a draft proposal, and the program officer will provide feedback. And so you can strengthen that proposal prior to submitting. And a National Science Foundation is also really good about that. So just some things to consider as you're reaching out. I've also found that foundations tend to be very helpful if you can secure a conversation with a foundation program officer. It may not always be a fit with current priorities, but oftentimes you'll glean some information on what may be coming up priority-wise with a foundation. Foundations are able to turn on a dime typically in terms of their funding priorities based on current needs, trends. COVID was a great example of that. A lot of foundations begin providing funding to support strategies to mitigate some of the impacts of COVID in various aspects of life. And so those conversations are so valuable to glean that information. So before I launch into some tips on talking to a program officer, Patrick, can you say a word or two about what Lane prefers in terms of any internal communication prior to reaching out?
Yeah, generally speaking, we like to make sure that whoever the responsible administrator of an area is that would be affected, that you have a conversation with them about this possible project. And we don't have a very set process, but what we encourage people to do is make sure to get at least a preliminary check off from the relevant vice president as well, because we just don't want people to put a lot of work into something that, for reasons of priority or sustainability or any other reasons that we would ultimately say no to a project. We would like to do that early on and have them maybe reconfigure and possibly look somewhere else. But it's mostly just wanting to save people the trouble of putting materials together and reaching out, and possibly even drafting a proposal and then finding out that it's not something we can support. So I would say just reach out early. If it's starting to look like you're at the point where you would reach out to a program officer, you definitely want to make sure that the relevant vice president is aware. And we're changing our grant seeking apparatus basically with the new fiscal year. I'm not sure what the ultimate form will be, but grants generally are going under Richard Plott, and the eventual plan, I think, is to have a 1.0 grants manager. So the idea would be to have all of that initial work go through them and seek approvals, et cetera. But right now it's sort of fluid. So I'd say just communicate early if you have an idea, make sure to the extent you can that people are on board before you get too far down that road.
Great, thank you. Those are some excellent points. And the other piece of that I would just add is that funders, if, for example, for a particular competition, a program officer gets 2 or 3 random calls from different staff or faculty members at the same institution on different projects, they're going to wonder, well, have they been coordinating internally? And that tends to work against an applicant. So I would certainly reinforce what Patrick just shared. So once you're to that point where you've gotten the go ahead, you feel like you're ready to reach out to a program officer, certainly you'll want to identify the correct program officer in looking at the solicitation. If you are responding to a particular solicitation, there is always a contact name or an office that you can reach out to. You can also obviously find lots of information on websites. Be respectful and professional, obviously, because that will be remembered. Again, this is about relationship building. Offer to provide your concept paper. You can do that as an attachment to an email, and we'll go over some ideas about email outreach to request a call. Or you can wait and then offer to provide that prior to actually having the phone conversation. Make contact early. And so if a competition or an opportunity has crossed your desk and the application is due, let's say in 2 weeks, that's probably not going to be probably not good to pursue in terms of being able to put forward your best foot, but also program officers want to know that you have been researching and are taking the grant cycle seriously. Again, we'll go through the email that requests a phone call, ask great questions, take notes if you're able to, and then spend as much time listening as talking. It's amazing how much you will learn if you're quiet. I have sat in on program officer phone conversations where I asked a simple question about anticipated priorities for the upcoming 12 months and just got so much information that was not reflected in any written materials or on their website. Always follow up with a thank you email. And then just be sure to reference your call in future communication. So in terms of a sample outreach email, once you have access to the slide deck, feel free to just copy and paste this into your email browser and then of course finagle it to be specific to your particular needs. But this is the format of what we recommend. If you are, certainly you might be doing outreach to understand in general if your project aligns with funding priorities, but you might also be responding to a particular competition. And so if it's the latter, make sure you reference that in your opening sentence. That second paragraph, really that brief description of your proposed work and why it might be a good fit. Really, I think you can keep that at 2 or 3 sentences, just like us program officers might be reading your email on their smartphone and they've got a tiny little screen and may not have the patience or the time to really scroll through a whole lot of information in email format. You can certainly provide possible days or times or ask what their availability is and the convenience of connecting by phone. And then make sure you include your contact information. So once you have a call, or if they respond to your email, and some agencies do have requirements that all correspondence be done by email or in writing for accountability purposes, you can ask these questions in email format, but obviously by phone is even better. It's important to give a brief introduction, to thank that person for their time, and then to initially start by asking if they feel that your project is a good fit for their funding priorities or the specific opportunity that you've emailed about. If they say no, they don't typically just say no, but if they hedge or say, well, we're not sure because of X, Y, and Z, always ask if there are other funding opportunities that they're aware of that might be a better fit, either within their agency or within other foundations or government agencies with whom they work, because program officers are a wealth of knowledge about the funding landscape. And particularly if you are identifying one that is specific to your field, that individual should have a fair amount of information or might have just some random ideas that you wouldn't have thought of. You can always then follow up with asking about recommendations for improving competitiveness based on what you have proposed. I think it's helpful to ask what common causes are for proposals being declined, because then you know those red flags that reviewers are looking for. The request range that you would recommend, that the program officer would recommend, that's another critical question to ask. Now, there are competitions that will actually give a range, but oftentimes they're quite broad, especially in the foundation world. You might see a statement that says grants up to $150,000 as an example. And so it's helpful once a program officer has heard about your project design, and you can say, we were thinking of proposing asking for $30,000 in funding. Do you feel that's appropriate given the scope of our project? And then finally, any preferred method for communication if you have additional questions that you would like to ask of the program officer. And back to that, listen more than talk. I've always liked this adage: if you want money, ask for advice. And if you want advice, ask for money. Okay, well, I'd like to, it looks like one of our attendees has dropped off. I'd like to just pause briefly to see if there are any questions before we move on to the proposal component section of the webinar. All right, hearing none, and feel free to interrupt me as I move forward, but I will go ahead and move forward then with the additional information on getting organized. So once applicants are ready to begin that formal application process, I always recommend that applicants create a checklist of required application elements, create a grant development plan, and that would include a timeline. We'll talk about that in just a moment. In developing a proposal, the very first step that I take once those two pieces have been completed is I create a narrative outline, and I create that within the actual formatting required by the particular competition. And what I will do is include headers, subheaders, and then within each section, I will create margin comments, and I'll copy the criteria specifically from that grant, the request for applications or the request for proposals. into each section so that I can cross-check in real time as I am populating those sections with information. I'll also at the beginning of the outline in margin comments delineate any page limitations, if there is character or word count limits, if it's, for example, an application that will be submitted through an online portal. Oftentimes there will be character or word counts rather than a page limit. So I always note those as well, because it's much more difficult to go in at the back end and realize that you're 5 pages over and need to cut. So after the narrative outline, of course, gathering the required information from key individuals and stakeholders, drafting proposal documents, certainly getting feedback and refining those documents as time allows, and then submitting that grant well ahead of application deadline. Particularly with the shift to online portals, we often encounter technical difficulties, or you will get into a portal and once you've populated one field, a new field will pop up that you weren't aware of. And so it's important to give yourself plenty of time prior to actually, to submit your application, plenty of time before deadline. And so for the timeline, you'll see on this slide, a suggested timeline. I think this is helpful to keep all individuals on track in the grant seeking process when you're looking at completing an application. It's particularly helpful if you are working with other individuals, collaborating organizations, or an external reviewer who is a key part of contributing to your application. And Patrick, I'd like to just ask quickly, are there internal deadlines that Lane Community College asks in terms of submitting, for example, an intent to apply for a grant or having an internal review before that grant is submitted to the funder?
So yes, it usually is per project, and moving forward, some other system might be imposed, but generally when I've worked with people on bigger projects, I request a budget up to 2 weeks before to make sure that can be run by the college CFO, the Chief Financial Officer. And then ideally, we try to get all materials to the person submitting a minimum of 1 week before the deadline, in order to start inputting that into the forms and making sure that there aren't any issues. As you were talking, I really wanted to implore people that if you're working on a larger federal project, you need to be planning that out well ahead of time. And the current grants.gov interface allows for the construction and assigning of a workspace for most applications. And it's really important to get your budget into that budget form to make sure that it doesn't throw errors. Most of the forms in grants.gov will allow you to do a check, and that can be done either by someone who's preparing the application and not the official institutional representative that signs the final one, or the institutional representative can do that. But that's something that ideally you want to do a week before the deadline, because you really don't want to be a couple of hours before 5 p.m. Washington, D.C. time, and some tiny element of a form doesn't work, or you're putting a budget number in the wrong place, and then you are unable to submit this project that you've worked on for a very long time. So lead time is really important to build in, particularly surrounding the submission. And at minimum, you really should plan on 1 week before the deadline, having everything in its final form and ready to be put in.
Great, thank you. And so in terms of creating a narrative outline, and I did touch upon this a couple of slides back, it's important to look at the required format, any required elements, and order. If it is not specified in the request for applications in terms of the order, I always follow verbatim how the information is presented in the RFA, and I'll even pull out headers and subheaders based on keywords that are used, and so that the reviewers are able to find that information easily. Because reviewers are typically working from a checklist, sometimes that will be included in the request for applications. Oftentimes it is not. And it's important to remember that the easier you make it for them to find information, the more competitive your grant will be. And so the elements of a grant application will vary widely across funders. And you can see listed on this slide what a typical application package will include. Certainly the federal competitions can be much more cumbersome in terms of the forms that are required. It's important to take note of all of those required elements in addition to the narrative. They can oftentimes take just as much time and energy because of, for example, signatures that may be needed, letters of support from collaborating institutions that you don't have control over as much as the timeliness of drafting the narrative. So make sure you note that on the front end and get that process going as soon as possible. We've spoken briefly about the formatting requirements. Unfortunately, grant applications are not the time to use a creative structure. In most cases, proposals are fairly predictable and conventional in terms of what the funder is requesting. And so that includes font, margins. It includes obviously page number, and if there are limitations, it's helpful to use subheadings, as I mentioned earlier, to make all elements visible. Everything should be easy to find. As a reviewer, now the Department of Ed has changed their policy under Betsy DeVos, but prior to Betsy DeVos serving as the secretary, the Department of Ed would instruct reviewers to, for example, if a competition had a 20-page limit, and that was specified in the RFA, we as reviewers were instructed to not consider any information beyond page 20. And so if an applicant went over and provided 2 or 3 really wonderful pages of substance, we just threw those in the trash and could not include those in our particular review criteria. So just be sure to check and make sure that you have the content in the order that it's required, and obviously within the page limit. So it's really interesting to look at academic writing versus grant writing. And this is a fantastic comparison of the two. And you'll see that there are some key pieces that academic writers tend to incorporate in their writing. Certainly that scholarly pursuit, academic writing can lean toward being past-oriented, work that has already been accomplished. It can be theme-centered and somewhat rhetorical in nature. Academic writing can have an impersonal tone, be fairly individualistic, especially in terms of research that may have been completed to date. There are a few length constraints, and so verbosity is rewarded, and then there can oftentimes be insider jargon. Grant writing, on the other hand, really is focused on a service attitude. And so what are the funder goals, and how is the service that you're offering to provide, the project, the research piece, how does that meet those funders' goals? Future oriented, so we're really looking at work that should be done, and project centered. We talked about objectives and activities that support those objectives. There should be a balance of selling and telling to the reader in terms of your approach. And your grant document should convey a sense of excitement and be team focused. I always like to include a statement with regards to how this project and those implementing the project for a particular grant opportunity are committed to a model of continuous program improvement and looking at mid-year and year-end evaluation and feedback and stakeholder engagement to make sure that that model is continually improving for the long term. Brevity is typically rewarded, and the last one is key: accessible language. It can be easily understood by someone in your field or someone that may be on the review panel, but is not a content area expert. I can't tell you how many times program officers have conveyed to me, "We're not scientists, please write for lay people and please be brief." Reviewers are typically fairly tired. They're typically reviewing on top of other full-time jobs. And so the easier you can make their review process, the more that will be rewarded. The number one way that I would recommend to improve your grant writing is to serve as a reviewer. It's a really influential way to gain firsthand knowledge of that review process, to learn about common problems that reviewers encounter with proposals. It's a wonderful networking opportunity to meet colleagues in your field or related fields, and then also to meet program officers in your field. When you begin to think as a reviewer, your ability to assess alignment and respond competitively to RFPs will improve dramatically. All right, well, this final section that we'll be covering today is really a grant narrative breakdown. And given the time that we have remaining, we'll be going through this fairly quickly. And so be sure to review these slides after the presentation, and we do have links to resources at the end as well. And so narrative components typically have similar core elements that you'll see on this slide. Each solicitation obviously requires information to be presented in specific ways and may or may not include these particular headers, but oftentimes the core content is the same. When we look at the introduction, that introduction really should serve to spark the reader's interest, to provide context for the reviewer on your specific project and your narrative, and to include the overarching goal or vision of your project. So be sure that you don't meander. It's not necessary to provide background information that doesn't specifically relate or isn't requested by the solicitation. And don't make general unsubstantiated claims about the impact of your project, because the reviewer is going to want to know, again, well, how do we know that this will happen? And you'll have the chance to justify that throughout your narrative. The statement of the problem really lets that reviewer know and helps them to understand why your project is worth doing. So this really, again, involves showing that problem, substantiating your problem or question with data, particularly for programmatic grants. I recommend, obviously, the more recent data. Boy, if you can get data to substantiate the problem or the need that's within the last year or two, that's fantastic. Certainly within the last 5 years, you can highlight trends that have been going on within the last 10 years, but data that is over 5 years old probably would not be seen as significant to justifying your problem statement. In the literature review, you'll want to review what has been done to address your problem to date, delineate the gap that you plan to fill, show that you understand your field, and cover any bases in terms of citations that are relevant to that field. And again, in looking at citations, the more recent, the better. Now, there may be some seminal work that was published 25 years ago that really is foundational to your approach, and it's fine to include that. Also, make sure you include relevant, more recent citations within the past 5 years, if available. And if not available, and your whole study or project is designed to address that gap, then call that out within your approach so that the reviewers don't just assume that you are working with outdated information and didn't take the time to research more relevant statistics. Your conceptual framework communicates the approach to the work, And so this is the section where you are identifying theories or concepts that guide the project. You're certainly wanting to describe how they will guide the work that you plan to do, and then connect theories or concepts to the work itself. And a logic model is a fantastic way to do this. One plug for logic models: if the solicitation doesn't require it, I would still recommend you do it for your own purposes. It's such a great process and activity, and typically a one-page at-a-glance visual that helps you understand and articulate your goals, your outcomes, project activities, inputs, all of those elements. With regards to your hypothesis or your research questions, it's important to clearly state what those research questions are and explain how answering those questions will ultimately solve your identified problem and fill gaps in the literature if that's what you are focused on doing. Don't be vague, be very direct with your wording, and make sure that any hypotheses you include are fully testable. In looking at your implementation plan, this plan really, I like to think of an implementation plan as a section that you should be able to isolate as its own document, print it off, hand it to the person who may have to take over while you're out on leave or exploring another opportunity. And that person should be able to know precisely what you were planning to do, when you were planning to do it, and the intended impact of each of those activities. And so make sure that all of the procedures, work, and protocols are included in your implementation plan. Include enough detail as well that the reviewer is able to judge that your project is feasible and appropriate given the scope and the budget. This is a sample project implementation plan. It's important to list milestones. So how will you know that that relevant activity has been implemented? Responsibility: who is responsible ultimately for making sure that activity has been implemented? And then the time frame for implementation. Your management plan needs to communicate your structure for accomplishing your scope of work. And so make sure you clearly explain how you will manage the project, indicate responsible individuals for each component of that project, describe how the project will be coordinated as a whole. Sometimes RFAs will require that you include an org chart to do that. And if not required, it can still be helpful if it's allowed with the formatting requirements. And certainly if it's not allowed, but it's helpful for you and your programmatic implementation, then do it anyway. Make sure that you're clear about responsibilities and management structure, so don't be vague. And this is a section too where you can say, for example, 0.5% or not 0.5%, a half-time position, 0.5 FTE will be devoted to coordinating project activities. And you can actually define the percentage of an FTE that may be responsible for the various aspects of program management. This slide shows you an example of a project management plan. Again, having the details, the individual who's responsible, and the time frame is very helpful. In looking at staff qualifications, make sure that you only include those qualifications that are relevant to the particular funding opportunity, and connect the qualifications directly to the work. No need to include super long bios. If you have stakeholders who have sent bios that you are hoping to include because they're required within an application, that's fine. You just need to make sure that you edit those bios, or you can ask the individual who sent it to you to edit to make sure it is brief and relevant to the particular priorities of that opportunity. The evaluation plan really does communicate how you measure and ensure your project success. And so make sure you follow the funder's guidance regarding the approach to evaluation, one of the very first questions I am seeking to find an answer to when I am analyzing a solicitation is whether an external evaluator is a required aspect of this particular competition, because if it is, that adds another component to securing an external evaluator, making sure that individual is on board to support the drafting or at least reviewing of your evaluation plan in the event that they end up needing to implement it. So make sure that you look at that early on in the process. And then finally, with the project budget, some tips for budget development: avoid cost surprises by gathering estimates and quotes as early as you can in the process. Another piece of that is, as a reviewer, if I see just a really well-rounded number like $200,000 for a grant request, I will question and spend extra time looking at the budget to see if the applicant just funded up because $200,000 was the upper cap of that funding opportunity. And so the more you can be fairly specific in terms of the actual cost amount, not to the, it can be rounded up to the highest $10, for example. But if a laptop costs $1,235, then call it like that. And don't round it up to $1,500 or $2,000 unless you anticipate the cost going up. In terms of a project budget, you'll see some typical budget line items. And Patrick, are there supports available internally at the college for applicants to support this budget development process?
There are some. We typically might give someone a template from a similar grant and have them develop that out. But at present, we don't really have a process for sitting down and working through the budget. It would be a good idea to sort of add that as a service, because it's, for someone who's not used to building budgets, it doesn't come second nature. But at present, our typical approach is to hand someone sort of a template and make sure that try to make sure that everything is applicable to allowable grant expenses. And that's the big thing, I think, for people to look at within the materials is what are allowable expenses. You don't want to put something in your budget that clearly cannot be funded, whether that's capital construction, any kind of remodeling. If it has to be purely programmatic and salaries or for some other purpose, you want to make sure to build your budget based on what the grant will allow you to spend on.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that's great. And in looking at budget narrative development, I just included a few tips on this slide in terms of how the narrative really should show, the budget narrative should show clearly how you calculated each item. And so the reviewer should be able to take your narrative and understand that I'll give an example. If you allocated $25,000, for example, for a program evaluation company, how that money in that pot would actually, or in that line item, would actually be spent. And so you can see a vague example of a budget narrative that just lumps all of these activities into the category of program evaluation at 25 grand. And then you can see a specific best practice example that describes the type of evaluation, the purpose, cost estimates, including hourly rate of the evaluator, number of hours worked, and travel costs associated with the site visits to be involved. So the more detail, the better with regards to that. I've included some common grant writing mistakes. In the interest of time, since we're nearing the end of our presentation, I will just leave those for individuals to look through on their own. Number 10, though, would definitely be a death blow. If your grant is submitted after deadline, there are few to no funders, and if you find one, please let us know, that will accept a grant that is submitted after deadline, unless you have developed a relationship with the program officer And there is communication. This doesn't happen usually in the federal realm, but sometimes with foundations, there's communication that your grant is on its way. And then finally, I'd just like to end by remembering the rule of 40 in terms of preparing your application. Always assume that your proposal is the 40th in a stack, that the reviewer has 40 other things they'd rather be doing, and that they haven't had a good night's sleep in 40 years. And so all that to say, present as clearly and succinctly as possible so that the program officers and the review panel are able to review and provide the most feedback that is relevant to your actual project design. I'm going to just reference that we have several resources available at the end of this slide deck that are linked. There are prospecting resources that I've included, several proposal development resources, including some wonderful logic model resources through the University of Wisconsin and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, evaluation resources, also linked in the slide deck. We at Hanover certainly are positioned and available and excited to support your team in developing competitive grants. And so you'll see a slide specific to resources that we offer as a company. And those include email alerts specific to your grant seeking. And you can subscribe to those by clicking on the link that's on that slide. And then we also have a grantsmanship training center. You can also subscribe to have digital access by clicking on the orange link at the bottom of the slide. And we're right at the 60-minute mark. And so I'm going to close out our conversation today. I sure appreciate your time, and we look forward to working with Lane Community College in the upcoming year.
Hi, this is